Hi everyone, welcome to part 2 of Descartes, week 2. For this week we examined the meditations, and in the previous video we looked at sort of the foundations of Descartes' projects, which are exhibited in the first and second meditation. So we talked about how Descartes has a method of skeptical doubt, and that method leads him to try to find one single point, an Archimedean point, from which he can build out an edifice to account for all of the kinds of knowledge that we have. However, the second meditation sort of leaves everything in suspense. So we've learned that we have the possibility of doubting all of the knowledge that we get from the senses. Descartes is going to talk about this as being imaginative knowledge. Now, his point isn't that, whenever we run into some finite object like a water bottle or whatever, that I'm simply imagining it and that it's not real. He's not using imagination as a contrast to remembering or something like that. By imagination, Descartes simply means that we have an image of it, right? And my ability to produce an image of it, it can be something that I receive from without through my senses, or it can be something that I do myself simply through my mind. Like I can, just as I imagine, say, this water bottle is red, I can detach one of its qualities, its redness, and give it another one. So I can sort of like imagine if it were green. Now, for Descartes, the distinction between something that we perceive and something that we merely imagine is a difference in degree of liveliness rather than a difference in kind. Because I can always discover, like we mentioned in the last video, that something that I believed that I had perceived, I had simply merely imagined. And so all that distinguishes perception from imagination for Descartes, insofar as they're distinct at all, is merely the degree of liveliness of the sensation. So what we're going to be doing at this point is Descartes has already established that anything that comes from the senses, or anything that can be merely imagined, there can be a distinction between the way that we think that it is and the way that it actually is. And so all of that knowledge is subject to the sort of methodological doubt that he examines in the first meditation. So in the second meditation, we finally have this point: ourselves, our own knowledge, our own subjectivity, the way that things appear to us, the fact that we are a thinking thing, that we render judgments about whether or not things exist. That is something that we cannot even coherently begin to doubt. So it's the thing that avoids the methodological skepticism of the first meditations. But the reason why this leaves us sort of on a cliffhanger is because it's like, okay, well, we do have some aspect of our knowledge, namely the cogito, that is not subject to methodological skepticism, but can we rebuild the edifice of knowledge that we think that we have? At this point, Descartes has sort of put out of play mathematical knowledge, geometric knowledge, in any kind of empirical science. And so the question is, do we have any of that kind of knowledge? And similarly, we can ask from a religious standpoint, what in religion does Descartes keep? So what is his conception of God, and how heterodox is that idea of God? So we're going to be talking about a lot about God and the idea of clear and distinct ideas, Descartes' account of the two substances, two finite substances, which are thinking substances and extended substances. Now, recall that a thinking substance is one like us that makes judgments about things, that affirms or denies, that chooses to do one thing rather than another. And an extended substance is something that takes up space such that another thing can't be there. So, my water bottle and a book cannot be in the same location at the same time. They exclude one another. They're extended substances in that sense. So things that take up space. My body takes up space, but my rendering of a judgment about something does not take up space. So insofar as I think about myself as a thinking thing, then I'm not spatially extended. I'm not simply my body that does take up space and interacts with other bodies, but I'm something more than that, a thinking thing. And so importantly, Descartes is not going to deny that we have a body or something like that. He's just going to deny that that is what principally makes us who we are. You know, our identity is something that for Descartes persists after the death of our body through a soul. And so this is an important dimension of Descartes' account. So let's begin with the God, because God is going to be the subject of the third meditation. Now, hopefully you can see this even with the slight glare. So God, importantly, has three features, or at least three features. And this is going to be true of most of the philosophical accounts of God that we're going to be examining over the course of this semester. Typically, they come from sort of Abrahamic tradition, where God is defined as having all perfections. And so what that means is, you know, at least one way of divvying up some of the perfections that God is meant to have is to say that God is omniscient, which means that God knows everything. There's nothing that God does not know, no imperfection that God has in virtue of not knowing something. God is omnipotent, which means that God has every power, every potency, every ability God has access to. And God is omnibenevolent. God is good. God is good beyond all human comprehension. And God is morally good. And this is going to be an important feature of Descartes' argument, as we're going to see. Okay, so these are some features of God. And Descartes is going to argue that simply in virtue of these features, we can know for certain that God exists. So we do not need to have any sort of like empirical investigation into the claims made by religious books. It's not necessary for us to give an empirical examination about whether or not various claims to miracles or whatever are true. The real way that we can know that God exists for Descartes is simply by virtue of the clarity and distinctness of the idea of God. So the basic idea is, in the same way that in the cogito, we know that we exist simply by virtue of reasoning well, by knowing that it's not even possible for me to deny my own existence. Similarly, in the case of God, Descartes is going to argue that if you have the appropriate understanding of God, that it's not even coherent to doubt whether or not God exists. And in fact, that it is only by virtue of our knowledge that God exists that we can come to rely on the sort of empirical knowledge that's given to us by our senses. Okay, so Descartes actually gives two arguments for the existence of God. One is an older argument that's not really unique to him, that I'm going to refer to as the ontological argument. You may have heard about this in previous classes. And then the second one, which is the one that's actually in the third meditation, is the Cartesian argument, or one that's relatively original to Descartes himself. Now, he uses both of these arguments. I think the ontological argument shows up in the fifth meditation, maybe the fourth one, whereas the Cartesian argument appears in the third meditation. And one thing that's kind of interesting about this is that in a later work called The Principles of Philosophy, Descartes switches the order of the ontological argument and the Cartesian argument. I think that it might actually make more sense to understand the Cartesian argument for the existence of God that occurs in the third meditation as a sort of modification, or maybe another version of the ontological argument that's given later and developed by other figures, like in the medieval tradition, like Anselm. Now, so the way that these arguments work is that they say that if you have an appropriate understanding of the concept of God, then you necessarily believe that God exists. So to begin with the ontological argument, the way that this argument goes is it says God is defined as that being that has every perfection. And secondly, that existence is a perfection. Okay? And the reason why this is plausible is because you would, in the case of like a pizza, like would you rather have an imaginary pizza or a real one? Assuming that you like pizza and you're not like lactose intolerant, or if you are lactose intolerant, that you're getting dairy-free pizza, or whatever else you want it, right? Or if you are averse to the pizza example, you can easily do like $100. Like, would you rather have a fake $100 or a real $100? Descartes' insight is basically, and this is the insight shared by many other Christian figures, is just that you would rather have the real $100 than the fake one. The real $100 or the real pizza is more perfect than the fake or imaginary pizza or $100. Okay, so what that establishes for these figures is that existence is a perfection. And so if existence is a perfection and God has every perfection, then God certainly has the perfection of existing, really existing. And so that's the ontological argument. Now, the ontological argument is actually extremely important for a number of these modern figures, because for a lot of them, some of their arguments for the existence of God is going to depend on some variant of the ontological argument. And you can actually see this reflected in the Cartesian argument that occurs in the third meditation. Now here, Descartes basically says, okay, so Descartes says we have this notion of God as that which is carrying all perfections, and that it is simply a fact of reason. Let me find the exact quotation. So this is quoted from the third meditation. Descartes says that it is manifest by the natural light that there must be as much reality in the efficient and total cause as in the effect of that cause. So what Descartes is saying is that the source of our representations has to be at least as much reality, that the source of our representations must have at least as much reality as those representations itself. So where did we get our idea of God? That's essentially Descartes' question. And Descartes is going to say, well, it can't come from the senses. Why can't it come from the senses? Well, because we don't really have the ability to have an image of God. Like we don't empirically imagine an omniscient, omnipotent, and omnibenevolent being. We don't really have a picture for what that could look like, and that's not even really coherent, because that would imply some sort of limitation on God. And so for Descartes, the source of the representation can't be the senses, it can't be something external to ourselves, and it can't represent merely nothing, simply in virtue of the fact that the idea is clear and distinct. It's at least as clear and distinct as, for Descartes, our geometric knowledge or our arithmetical knowledge. Like, there's nothing incoherent, at least Descartes thinks, in the idea of God is that which carries all of these perfections. And so what is the source of this idea? Well, it must come from God, him or herself, themselves. And so that's the Cartesian argument for the existence of God. And so what sort of unites this ontological argument and the Cartesian argument is this notion that if you simply understand what it means, what the concept of God means, then you know, in virtue of having all of the perfections that God exists. Now this is going to be very important for some of the later chapters. So, one thing that you might start to worry about is, well, if God is the source of our ideas, or at least is the source of our idea of God, then is God responsible for mistaken ideas that we have? And this is the primary topic of the fourth meditation. And so we're finite entities. We are limited in various ways, but the way that Descartes isolates that we are like God is in our will. For Descartes, our ability to decide to affirm or deny any sort of judgment is akin to the power of God. That the will is the sense in which we are infinite and like God, and that we can choose to deny. We're sort of like self-causing in the way that God is self-causing whenever we think about our own judgments, that we decide them not on the basis of anything else, but on our own assessment of the evidence and so on. And so the way that we arrive at error is when we make a judgment on something that's different than the way that things actually are. And so Descartes says it's actually appropriate that God allows us to make mistakes, because that's what allows us to reflect the infinite capacity of God in our own finite embodied selves. And so error doesn't, strictly speaking, come from God. It comes from us as being given the capacity by God to decide on the truth or falsity of our judgments. And so what comes from this is basically a program. So now Descartes says, okay, so we can know now that God is not an evil deceiver, and in fact that God would not allow for the existence of an evil deceiver, because that would contradict either the omnipotence, omniscience, or omnibenevolence of God. There couldn't be an evil demon that God didn't know about, because God knows everything. There couldn't be an evil demon that God couldn't stop, because God is omnipotent. And God would not allow for the existence of an evil demon, because God is omnibenevolent. And so Descartes uses this to establish that we can now know that God would not allow us to be deceived by clear and distinct ideas. And by clear and distinct ideas, what Descartes has in mind is those concepts that we have by virtue of reason alone, that are not the result of an empirical investigation and do not stem from any sort of imaginative endeavor in the way that we described the imagination previously. And so now we can kind of have back our knowledge of a priori sciences. So these are sciences which are not based on empirical investigation at all. So like mathematics, right? You don't need any sort of empirical investigation to know that in geometry, the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. That's going to be true simply in virtue of a correct understanding of all of the concepts involved. You don't need to go on an empirical scientific investigation to experiment and discover these aspects of reality. You simply know them by virtue of the correct operation of your reasoning. So, to kind of get us back to the sort of outline that we have here, we know bodies, extended things, simply through our capacity to be affected by them and to imagine them. Whereas we know things, we know clear and distinct ideas simply in virtue of being a rational, intellectual substance. So now we have a metaphysical picture where there's two distinct kinds of finite substances, namely intellectual substances, the sort of thing that we are, that can decide whether or not things are true. They can decide to act in a certain way, and so on. And then we have extended substances, and those are like bodies, those are like books and tables and chairs and all the rest of it, stuff that takes up space and excludes other things from taking up that space. So Descartes' rationalist program is basically him saying that, okay, well, in virtue of the sort of shock that experimental natural science has introduced into our beliefs, what we need is a fundamental reformation of the edifice of our knowledge. And the way that we do that is by following ideas that are clear and distinct, ideas that emerge simply from virtue of the rational structure of our subjectivity. So our notion of ourselves and our notion of God are things that we have simply through the intellect rather than through the imagination. And we can still, have access to the experimental and empirical natural sciences. However, those kinds of sciences are always going to be subject to revision because they depend on our receiving impressions from the outside world, and those can always change. We can always receive new data that causes us to revise fundamentally our theory of how empirical phenomena work. Whereas the ideas that we have simply by virtue of our rationality, ideas that are clear and distinct, those are not revisable, and so those can serve as sort of a foundation, a stable guiding force for the development of the natural sciences. And so Descartes has accomplished in the Meditations not only, sort of like proposing a program for modernity, which is only believe in those beliefs that you can know with certainty. And he has established at least two of those beliefs that we can have completely in virtue of the clarity and distinctness of those ideas. And that's the cogito, so the knowledge that I exist, and the existence of God. I can know those purely by virtue of the concepts involved. And then I can see that that provides me an epistemological criteria to evaluate those items of our knowledge that are going to be foundational, that ground or justify or condition all of our other knowledge. So all other knowledge is conditioned by the fact that I'm a thinking substance for Descartes, whereas that knowledge is not conditioned by anything else. And so this is really what is the rationalist program in Descartes. It's not that he's opposed to empirical investigations or natural scientific investigations. In fact, like I mentioned, he was engaged in those himself. But that he thought that these investigations are themselves conditioned by certain rational ideas that we have in virtue of being a thinking substance. And so he tries to provide sort of like a metaphysical foundation for how we can engage with and approach the natural sciences and religion that provides us a method for understanding what in those is rational, what in those orthodox traditional beliefs is true, what that is discovered by natural science is true, and do those worlds come together? And for Descartes, that they do. That Descartes, you can know simply by virtue of our rationality, the existence of God and the existence of ourselves, and this provides a coherent world where we can gain some sort of revisable knowledge from the natural sciences, but that this is always going to be secondary to the clarity and distinctness that we get through purely mathematical, geometric, or purely philosophical sciences. Okay, this is Descartes' basic picture, where we have knowledge of ourselves as thinking substances, and we have knowledge of clear and distinct ideas, and then those serve as the foundation or infrastructure through which we have various sorts of beliefs that are more subject to revision and alteration than those ideas. And so Descartes' modern project is to see, can we ground all of our empirical beliefs in this purely rational infrastructure? And that is, I think, that what most people refer to as Descartes' rationalism. I'm interested to hear what you all think about Descartes' program. We're going to be talking about specific aspects of it in coming weeks. Like, for example, one question that is maybe introduced by the meditations but not yet resolved is, well, if there is one notion of myself purely as a thinking thing, but there's also another notion of myself as something that is a thinking thing that also is embodied, that also engages in the empirical world, how do those dimensions of our existence interact with one another? Can Descartes give a coherent account of that? And so that's something that we're going to build on and discuss in the following weeks, and I hope that you've found Descartes really fascinating. Thanks. Bye.